The air was thick with tension in the drafty chambers of the French court. Frederick Baudouin, a man known for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect, stood before John Calvin, the towering figure of the Protestant Reformation. The room was filled with the heavy silence of impending conflict, a silence that was soon shattered by Baudouin's unwavering voice. Calvin, Baudouin began, his tone measured but firm. You claim to seek the truth, yet your methods only sow discord and division. The colloquy of Poissy was a beacon of hope, a rare moment of religious dialogue. Why do you dismiss such efforts when they could bring peace and unity to the Church? Calvin's eyes flashed with a mix of indignation and disdain. Baudouin, you misunderstand. The Church is in dire need of transformation, not just reform. The corruption and heresy that have taken root must be uprooted entirely. The old ways are irredeemable. Baudouin's face remained composed, but his words carried a weight of conviction. Transformation, or is it destruction? The Apostolic Church, the one built by the early fathers, is the true foundation of our faith. Your so-called Reformation seeks to dismantle this very foundation. You are no different from the Donatists of old, who claimed the interior church could save us. Calvin's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, his voice sharp. The Donatists were heretics. They refused to see the truth, just as you refuse to see the truth now. You cling to a corrupt institution, one that has strayed from the path of Christ. Baudouin shook his head, his eyes reflecting a deep sorrow. Calvin, you speak of truth, but your methods are those of tyranny. You condemn and burn those who disagree with you. You have made yourself a pope of a new church demanding absolute obedience and silencing all dissent. Is this the path of Christ? Is this the way to bring peace and unity? The room was electric with the force of their arguments. Baudouin continued, his voice growing more passionate. We seek no other peace and unity than that which is of Christ, a reformation that seeks to fix problems and abuses, not to tear down the entire structure. The church can be renewed, but it must be done in a spirit of love and reconciliation, not through fear and coercion. Calvin's expression was one of stubborn resolve. You speak of love and reconciliation, but your words are hollow. The church is beyond repair. It must be transformed, not just reformed. The true Church of Christ will rise from the ashes of the old, purified and strengthened. Baudouin's voice softened, but his resolve did not waver. Calvin, I urge you to reconsider. Be the author and promoter of unity, not disorder. We can work together to restore the Church, to bring it back to its original state, the state of the early fathers. This is the true path, the path of Christ. I will not compromise on the truth. The church must be transformed, and I will not rest until that transformation is complete. As the two men faced off, the tension in the room was palpable. The future of the French church hung in the balance, and the path forward was far from clear. Baudouin and Calvin, both driven by their convictions, were locked in a battle that would shape the religious landscape of France for generations to come. The debate was just the beginning. Outside the chambers, the winds of change were gathering, and the storm of religious conflict was brewing. Baudouin's words echoed in the minds of those who heard him, stirring a hope for a middle way, a path that could bring peace and unity to a divided land. But the road ahead was fraught with challenges, and the battle for the soul of the French church was far from over. In July 1552, du Moulin arrived in Basel, a city bustling with scholarly activity. For the next year, he moved around among the Calvinists in Geneva, Lausanne, and Neuchâtel. He hoped to find a teaching position at the Lausanne Academy, but the Bernese authorities couldn't accommodate him. In Lausanne, he stayed with his former lodger, Hartmann, who noticed that Duke Moulin was becoming very interested in Calvin's books. Later, Duke Moulin would claim that he always opposed the Calvinists, but this isn't true. His letters from that time show that he had friendly relations with Calvin and his followers. Du Moulin's correspondence suggests that he saw himself as a full supporter of the Swiss Reformed churches during these years. This is especially clear during his time in Tübingen. In September 1553, Du Moulin left Neuchâtel and went to Strasbourg, then to Tübingen, where he found a job teaching law. Some older accounts say that his enemies in Tübingen labeled him an ubiquitist, which means someone who believed in the Lutheran idea that Christ's body is everywhere. However, this isn't true. Du Moulin wrote to Bullinger, a prominent Reformed leader, that he strongly opposed the doctrine of ubiquity, calling it false and monstrous. Du Moulin also refused to take communion in Tübingen because he didn't want to condemn the Reformed churches where he had taken communion before. He wrote to Bullinger, "I did not want to seem to condemn the holy churches by which I have communed, and to adhere to a schismatic church." This shows that Du Moulin was firmly aligned with the Reformed churches, not the Lutherans. Du Moulin could also clearly tell the difference between Lutherans and Catholics. He wrote to Bullinger, "Some here are clear and obstinate papists. Others are Lutherans, but not pure Lutherans, for they hold to an Augsburg confession corrupted by horrible pseudo-adiaphora. Others are of the two religions, and others have no religion." This shows that he was involved in distinct disputes with both Lutherans and Catholics. He fought with Lutherans over the doctrine of the Eucharist, and with Catholics over graduation ceremonies at the university. Du Moulin criticized the dean of the arts faculty for announcing graduations by apostolic authority, which he saw as a Catholic practice. He argued that the university should be Christian and based on the authority of the princes and the university itself, not the Pope. He said, "The frauds, deceits, and idolatries of the Roman Antichrist have been uncovered, and after they have been destroyed, we must not bring them back." These conflicts in Tübingen led Du Moulin to look for a new job. Duke Christoph of Württemberg invited him to Montbéliard, a French-speaking city under the jurisdiction of Christoph's uncle, Georg. Du Moulin moved there in October 1554, hoping to be closer to his wife and children, whom he hadn't seen in over 2 years. He also believed that, with support from the Württembergers, he could turn Montbéliard into a religious refuge for jurists. However, Count Georg never built the school or printing press, and Du Moulin's family couldn't move to Montbéliard. Du Moulin became frustrated, and in May 1555 he signed a letter from the barbarian land of Montbéliard. Over the next year, Du Moulin's frustration grew. In June 1556, he decided to return to France, even if it meant pretending to be Catholic. He fled to Catholic Dole and then to Paris, where he arrived on January 21, 1557. His first wife, Louise, had already died. When Du Moulin returned to France, he was reinstated as a lawyer and remarried to Jeanne du Vivier. Despite his return, his religious beliefs didn't change. He continued to support evangelical ideas, as evidenced by the dedications in his new books. He dedicated works to key Huguenot leaders like Antoine of Navarre, Jean d'Albret, and Gaspard de Coligny. In 1561, he published a treatise on the French monarchy, but it was filled with evangelical ideas. He criticized the use of images in churches, praised communion in both kinds, and defended the Waldensians, a group persecuted by Catholics. In 1563, Du Moulin's conflicts with the Calvinists continued. He was living in Orleans, which had been taken by the Huguenots. He wrote a catechism and gave theology lessons, but the local Calvinist pastors forced him to stop, saying he had no right to do so. In Lyon, the Reformed pastors condemned his catechism, and he was briefly imprisoned for allegedly writing a controversial book advocating open revolt against the king. His wife Jean was also told by a reformed consistory to divorce him and remarry someone from their sect. The 1565 National Synod of the French Reformed Churches condemned Dumoulin's union and harmony of the evangelists, and warned people not to attend his sermons or take the sacraments from him. Moulin was constantly at odds with the French Reformed churches for 3 years. He took his revenge in a bitter, pseudonymous diatribe against the Calvinists, written at the end of his life. He accused the Calvinist leaders of trying to take over all ecclesiastical power in France and of having no basis in French law for their consistory system. He also expressed personal resentment over their attempts to break up his marriage. Charles du Moulin was a complex figure in the French Reformation. He was a Gallican jurist, which means he was a legal expert who believed in the authority of the French church and the French king over the church. Du Moulin was critical of the Calvinist ministers who he thought had no right to preach or interpret the Bible. He believed that the true authority to teach and preach the Bible belonged to the bishops, archbishops, and other learned men in France, not the Calvinists. Du Moulin's views on religion were a mix of different ideas. He admired the work of Melanchthon, a German reformer, and agreed with some of his teachings. However, when it came to the Eucharist, the bread and wine used in communion, he sided more with Bullinger, another reformer, who had a different view from Calvin. Du Moulin saw himself as a free thinker, someone who could think independently and didn't belong to any specific religious group. He believed that his understanding of Christianity could help the French church move forward. Du Moulin was part of a group of reformers who were critical of the Calvinists. They saw themselves as the true heirs of the early French evangelicals who had been spreading the message of the gospel in France long before Calvin. Du Moulin argued that the Calvinists were not reforming the church, but were instead creating a new schismatic church. He believed that the Calvinists were trying to establish a new system of authority that was worse than the old one. Du Moulin and his allies had strong ties to the French nobility. They were reformers who wanted to change the church from within, rather than breaking away from it completely. This put them in a difficult position, as they were caught between the Catholic Church and the Calvinists. Du Moulin and others like him, such as Jean de Montluc and François Baudouin, had connections to many of the important Huguenot nobles, including Antoine of Navarre and Jean d'Albret. Du Moulin and his group argued that the Calvinists were trying to take control of the French church and were using their consistories, local church councils, to do so. They believed that these consistories were illegitimate and that the traditional French ecclesiastical hierarchy should be preserved. Du Moulin also criticized the Calvinists for their treatment of other reformers, such as those who were part of the Vaud movement. He saw the Calvinists as trying to force everyone to accept their specific beliefs and to eliminate other forms of evangelical Christianity. In his writings, Du Moulin often referred to the light of the gospel that had come to France long before Calvin. He believed that the Calvinists were actually destroying this light by imposing their own ideas and creating a new, more rigid form of religion. Du Moulin's arguments were part of a larger struggle within the French church, where different groups were vying for control and influence. Du Moulin and his allies also had connections to other reformers across Europe who were critical of Calvin. They mentioned people like Castellio and Zebedee, who were also opposed to the Calvinist movement. Du Moulin defended these individuals and used their experiences to support his own views. He saw the Calvinists as a foreign influence that was trying to take over the French church and impose a new, rigid structure. In the 1560s, Du Moulin and his group were part of a network of anti-Calvinist evangelicals who were trying to maintain the traditional French church while still pushing for reform. They were in constant tension with the Calvinists, who were gaining more and more support among the French nobility. Du Moulin and his allies used their connections and their arguments to try to keep the reform-minded nobility from joining the Calvinist cause. One of the key figures in this struggle was Jean Morley, who was excommunicated by the Calvinists for writing that the Calvinist ministers had taken over the church and that their consistories were illegitimate. De Moulin and Morley, though they had different views on some issues, found common ground in their opposition to the Calvinists. The struggle between the traditional French evangelicals and the Calvinists was a complex and often bitter one. Du Moulin and his allies saw themselves as the true defenders of the French Church, while the Calvinists saw them as obstacles to their vision of reform. This conflict played out in the halls of power in France and had a significant impact on the course of the French Reformation. François Baudouin was a man who lived during a very turbulent time in France. It was a period when religious differences often led to conflict. Baudouin, a learned man, was caught in the middle of these disputes, trying to find a way for people to live together in peace. One day, the Prince of Condé, a powerful man in France, wrote a letter to the king. In this letter, he expressed his concerns about the problems in the church. He said that many bishops were lazy and only cared about their wealth. They didn't take their duties seriously and often left their dioceses to enjoy the comforts of Paris while their churches were in trouble. Condé also mentioned that some young, inexperienced people were given important positions in the church, which was a big mistake. Condé then advised the king to humble himself before God and to work on changing his ways. He suggested that the king should make sure the Bible was taught and understood properly, without being twisted by those who wanted to use it for their own gain. He also recommended that the king should encourage daily sermons in the royal household and that the royal family should sing psalms and spiritual songs instead of frivolous tunes. Baudouin, who was a respected scholar, was part of the discussions about these religious issues. He believed that a general council could help bring peace to the Christian world, just as it had done in the past. If a general council wasn't possible, he suggested a national one, like the ones held by earlier kings of France. However, not everyone agreed with Baudouin's ideas. The Bishop of Valence, for example, gave a sermon before the king that was more harmful than helpful. His sermons lacked structure and didn't provide much useful content. Baudouin also mentioned that the bishop had given a small book to the king which contained some heretical ideas. Baudouin's efforts to promote religious peace and understanding were not always well received. He had to move from place to place, sometimes even leaving France, to avoid trouble. He wrote to his friend John Calvin, a famous religious leader, about his struggles and his desire to do what was right. In one of his letters, Baudouin expressed his admiration for Calvin and his work in reforming the church. He even considered Calvin a father figure and sought his advice on important matters. Baudouin was torn between his desire to help the church and his fear of making mistakes. Despite the challenges, Baudouin continued to work towards religious harmony. He believed that a moderate approach, one that respected both the old traditions and the new ideas, was the best way to achieve peace. He hoped that the king and other powerful leaders would listen to his suggestions and work towards a more united and peaceful society. However, Baudouin's efforts were not always appreciated. Some people, like John Calvin, saw him as a dangerous meddler. Calvin wrote a harsh response to Baudouin's ideas, accusing him of being too compromising and not standing firmly for what he believed in. Despite the opposition, Baudouin remained committed to his vision of religious peace. He continued to write and to speak, hoping that his words would make a difference. His efforts, though often unrecognized, were part of a larger movement that sought to bring harmony and understanding to a deeply divided world. The year was 1561, and the air in Europe was thick with tension. Religious conflicts were tearing communities apart, and two prominent figures, Jean Calvin and François Baudouin, found themselves at the center of a heated dispute. Calvin, a leading figure of the Reformation, faced off against Baudouin, a jurist and political thinker, in a series of written exchanges that would shape the religious landscape of the time. Calvin, known for his strict interpretation of Christianity, wrote a response to an unnamed mediator, accusing this person of trying to create a middle ground between Catholics and Protestants. Calvin saw this as a dangerous compromise, believing that true religion could not be diluted. He wrote, "The true religion is not found among the papists or among us, but rather both sides are tainted with many errors." This statement encapsulated his belief that any attempt to blend the two was a threat to the purity of the faith. Baudouin, on the other hand, was more moderate. He argued for a different approach, one that sought unity and peace. In his work, Ad leges de famosis libellis, Baudouin criticized the harshness of Calvin's stance. He wrote, "Intolerable in the church is tyranny. If you restrain yourself, you will act wisely. Others also know what religion is, and you are wrong if you think you are already seated on a throne where you can do as you please, insult everyone, and rule alone." Baudouin believed that the path to reform should be one of dialogue and understanding, not of division and authoritarianism. The debate between Calvin and Baudouin grew more intense. Calvin accused Baudouin of being a Niconite, a term used to describe those who claimed to be neutral but were actually undermining the faith. Baudouin, in his Responsio altera ad Ion Calvinum, defended himself, emphasizing the importance of unity and peace in the church. He wrote, "I beseech you, be a promoter and author of unity rather than, to use Paul's words, of chaos. Unity and Christian peace, which can lead to the reformation of the church, are what we seek." The conflict extended beyond just theological differences. Personal attacks and accusations of apostasy were common. Calvin wrote that Baudouin, having been an apostate so many times, does not deserve any more credit than a dog and an enemy of the cross of Christ. Baudouin, in turn, accused Calvin of being too rigid and intolerant, writing, "You condemn almost all heresies, and you want to burn those you condemn. Then you kill those who do not agree with you. Whom then do you leave alive?" The dispute also involved other key figures of the time. Theodore de Bèze, a close ally of Calvin, wrote a response to Baudouin, defending his mentor and attacking Baudouin's character. Baudouin, however, remained steadfast in his call for a more nuanced and peaceful approach to religious reform. He believed that the church should return to its original form, as seen in the works of early church fathers like Ambrose, Augustine, and Chrysostom, rather than creating a new, rigid structure. Baudouin's stance was influenced by his interactions with important political figures. He had a significant conversation with the Cardinal of Lorraine about religious controversies, which he described as more religious and sincere than any he had had with Calvin. Baudouin also received support from the Prince of Conde, who was dissatisfied with the militant tactics of the new preachers and desired a more gentle and effective reform. The debate between Calvin and Baudouin was not just a theological disagreement, it was a struggle over the future of the Church and the direction of the Reformation. Baudouin's moderate and conciliatory approach stood in stark contrast to Calvin's strict and uncompromising stance. While Calvin sought to purify the Church through rigid adherence to his interpretation of the Bible, Baudouin believed that true reform could only come through unity and a return to the early Church's practices. As the years passed, the conflict between these two men and their followers continued to shape the religious and political landscape of Europe. The legacy of their debate would be felt for generations to come, as the struggle for religious reform and unity remained a central issue in the history of the Reformation. Charles du Moulin was a man of great intellect and deep faith, but his journey through the tumultuous religious and political landscape of 16th century Europe was far from easy. His work and ideas often put him at odds with both Catholic and Protestant authorities, making his life a series of challenges and conflicts. In 1552, the Faculty of Theology in Paris condemned one of his works, describing it as dangerous, scandalous, and heretical. They accused it of aligning with the heresies of the Waldensians, Wycliffites, Hussites, and Lutherans. This was a serious accusation, and it reflected the intense scrutiny du Moulin faced from the Catholic Church. Despite this, he continued to defend his beliefs even when it meant standing alone. When he moved to Lausanne, du Moulin found himself in a community that was largely supportive of the Reformation. However, his relationship with the leading reformer, John Calvin, was complex. In a letter to Calvin, du Moulin expressed his frustration with the Papists, a term he used to describe not only the Catholics, but also the Lutherans whom he saw as not pure enough in their faith. He felt that the Lutherans were fomenting horrible pseudodiaphoras, or false compromises, and that they were not truly committed to the reformation of the Church. In 1554, du Moulin's troubles continued. While at the University of Tübingen, he faced opposition from both the Catholic and Lutheran factions. He wrote to Heinrich Bullinger, a prominent Swiss reformer, about the difficulties he encountered. The Papists, he said, wanted to exclude him from the theological discussions, and he refused to participate in the communion service because he did not want to appear to be condemning the churches he had previously been a part of. He felt that participating would mean supporting a schism which was against his principles. Du Moulin's stance on the uliquity doctrine, which was a central issue among the Lutherans, further isolated him. He described the doctrine as not only false, but also monstrous and intolerable. He also expressed his concern about the authority of the Pope, whom he considered the Antichrist, and the need for the Church to remain true to the Word of God and the Reformation. Despite the challenges, du Moulin remained committed to his beliefs. He wrote to Boniface Emerbach, a friend and fellow scholar, that he would never compromise on matters of religion. He also sought the support of the Duke of Württemberg, hoping to establish a new haven for the Church of God in Montbéliard, a region that was under the Duke's protection. In 1555, du Moulin left Tübingen and settled in Montbéliard. He continued to write and correspond with various reformers, including Bullinger, and he maintained his critical stance against the Catholic Church and the Lutheran reforms he found problematic. He also expressed his desire to return to Paris, where he had been a respected jurist and professor. His return to Paris in 1558 was a significant moment as he was reinstated by the Paris Parlement, a sign that his contributions to law and theology were still valued. Du Moulin's writings on the history and governance of France reflect his deep concern for the moral and religious state of the country. He believed that the Kingdom of France should follow the examples of the good kings of Judah, like Hezekiah and Josiah, who had restored true religion and abolished idolatry. He also criticized the practices of the Catholic Church, such as the veneration of saints and the withholding of the Eucharist in both kinds, which he believed were contrary to the Word of God. One of his most significant works, the Concile sur les Faits du Concile de Trente, was a detailed critique of the Council of Trent, which he saw as heretical because it mixed tradition with Scripture and gave the Pope absolute authority. He argued that the true Christian faith should be based solely on the Word of God, and that any addition or alteration was a deviation from the truth. Du Moulin's life was marked by his unwavering commitment to his beliefs, even when it meant standing against powerful institutions and individuals. His work on the Collatio et Unio Quatuor Evangelistarum, the harmony of the four Gospels, was a testament to his deep understanding of the Bible and his desire to bring clarity to the teachings of Christ. However, this work also brought him into conflict with the Calvinist authorities, who accused him of errors and warned against his teachings. In 1565, Du Moulin wrote Apologie de Morlaix du Moulin contre un livret, a defense against the accusations made against him by the Calvinist ministers. He accused them of arrogance and a desire to control the faith and consciences of others. He argued that they had no right to claim a monopoly on the interpretation of Scripture and that their authority was illegitimate. The conflicts with the Calvinist ministers continued, and in 1566, Du Moulin wrote Against the Calumnies of the Calvinists, a pseudonymous work that further criticized the Calvinist leadership. He accused them of using religion as a means to gain power and wealth, and he warned against their ambition and greed. Despite the many challenges he faced, Charles Du Moulin remained a strong and principled figure, dedicated to the reformation of the Church and the defense of true Christian faith. His life and work continue to be a testament to the importance of standing firm in one's beliefs, even in the face of great adversity. In 1562, John Morley, a minor French nobleman, published a book that caused quite a stir among the French Reformed churches. He dedicated his work to Pierre Viret, a close friend of John Calvin, hoping this would win him some favor. But it didn't work out that way. In April, the National Synod of the French Reformed Churches, meeting in Orléans, declared that Morley's book contained wicked doctrine and warned the faithful to be cautious about it. The book, titled A Treatise on Christian Discipline and Polity, challenged the way the French Reformed churches were run. The Synod was particularly upset because Morley seemed to be trying to undermine the French discipline, which was established in 1559. This discipline set the rules for how the churches should be organized and governed, and it gave a lot of power to the pastors and consistories, groups of church leaders. To understand why Morley's book was so controversial, we need to look at how the Calvinist churches were organized. In the early days of the Reformed movement, there was a big conflict over who should choose the pastors. In Geneva, a city where John Calvin had a lot of influence, the pastors decided to use a system called cooptation. This meant that the local pastors would choose a new pastor, and then the people would approve the choice. The idea was to make sure that the new pastor was qualified and that the community was happy with this selection. However, in practice, the people's role in this process was limited. The pastors and consistories did most of the decision-making, and the people were only asked to give their final approval. This was especially true in places where there wasn't a Protestant government to help with the selection process. For example, in Lausanne, the pastors added a step where candidates had to be examined at the local school before being considered. This gave the Lausanne Academy more control over the process. John Morley had a different idea. He believed that the current system was flawed and that it didn't truly reflect the will of the entire church. He argued that what affects all must be heard by all. This meant that major decisions in the church, such as choosing pastors, resolving doctrinal disputes, and dealing with moral issues, should be decided by the whole congregation, not just the pastors and consistories. Morley's book was divided into 4 sections. The first section dealt with doctrine, the second with moral discipline, the third with elections, and the fourth with other matters of church order. He believed that the power to judge doctrine should belong to the entire church, not just a select few. He wrote, "The power to judge doctrine according to the Word of God, to eliminate disagreements over it, and to interpret it is given to the Church." When it came to making decisions on doctrine, Moulin proposed a process where the ministers and elders would first discuss the issue. If they thought it was important enough to involve the whole church, they would call a meeting. The church would be divided into smaller groups by neighborhood or parish to avoid confusion. A minister would explain the issue, and then anyone who wanted to speak could do so, with older members speaking first. Women and children under 15 would not be allowed to participate in the discussion. Moulin argued that even in large cities like Paris, this system could work. He believed that by gathering the opinions of many people, the church could make better decisions. He wrote, "As for the city of Paris and other similar cities, it would not be difficult to avoid the confusion that some fear if the church is divided into several neighborhoods or parishes." The Calvinist leaders were not happy with Moulin's ideas. They saw his proposal as a threat to their authority and the order they had established. The National Synod of 1562 warned the faithful to be wary of Moulin's ideas, and the conflict between Moulin and the Calvinist leaders continued for years. Moulin's challenge to the Calvinist system was not just about church governance, it was also about French patriotism. Moulin and his supporters resented the way Geneva, a foreign city, seemed to control French church affairs. They believed that the French church should be run by French people, not by Genevan pastors. This feeling of nationalism was shared by other French Protestants, including some nobles and clergy, who supported Moulin's vision. Despite the opposition, Moulin's ideas had a lasting impact. They showed that there were different ways to organize the Reformed Church, and that not everyone agreed with the Calvinist model. Moulin's challenge to the status quo highlighted the ongoing tensions within the Reformed movement and the diverse views on how the church should be governed. Even after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when many French Protestants were killed, some still blamed the Genevans for instigating the violence. One of these was Pierre Charpentier, a former professor at the Geneva Academy, who wrote that the Genevans, particularly Theodore Beza, had encouraged disloyalty to the French crown. This sentiment echoed Moulin's earlier criticisms and showed that the debate over church governance was deeply intertwined with French national identity. In the end, Moulin's book and his challenge to the Calvinist system remain a significant part of the history of the French Reformed churches. They remind us that the Reformation was not just about breaking away from the Catholic Church, but also about how to organize and govern the new churches that emerged. John Moulin's ideas about how the church should be run didn't fit neatly into the categories of the time. He wasn't a strict Congregationalist who believed each church should make its own decisions. Instead, he had a vision of the church that was more like a big family, where everyone had a role to play. But the most important decisions were made by a group of wise, well-educated people in the main city churches. Moulin believed that the church in a big city, like Paris, should include all the smaller churches around it. He thought that decisions like who should be a minister should be made by the whole church, not just a few leaders. This meant that when a new minister was chosen, everyone in the church should have a say, not just the pastors or elders. He also believed that if a minister did something wrong, only the whole church could remove them from their position. When it came to discipline, Moulin took the Bible very seriously. He thought that if someone in the church did something wrong, the whole church should be involved in deciding what to do. This was different from what many other reformers believed. Some thought only the church leaders should handle discipline, while others thought the government should be involved. Moulin wanted the whole church to be involved, making it more like a community where everyone cared for each other. Moulin also believed in the importance of education. He thought that each region should have a good school and a university to train ministers. This way, the best people would be chosen to lead the church, and they would be well prepared for their roles. He also suggested that deaconesses, women who could help the poor and the sick, should be brought back into the church. This was a forward-thinking idea at the time, as many churches didn't allow women in such roles. When it came to big meetings or synods, Moulin had a mixed view. He thought that local and regional synods could be helpful, but he was wary of national synods. He feared that these larger meetings could become places of disagreement and division. Instead, he believed that local churches should have the final say in their own affairs. Moulin's ideas were different from the model used in Geneva, which was led by John Calvin. Calvin's model gave a lot of power to the church leaders, especially the pastors and elders. Moulin's model, on the other hand, gave more power to the local community and the local elites. This made his ideas appealing to many French nobles and intellectuals who didn't want to take orders from Geneva or the national synods. Even though Moulin's ideas were never fully implemented, they were not just theoretical. He drew on his experiences in different Protestant communities and the long tradition of local church reform in France. His ideas were practical and designed to work in the real world, not just in theory. This is why his work was seen as a real threat by his opponents, especially Theodore Beza, who succeeded Calvin in Geneva. Moulin's path to becoming a controversial figure in the Reformed world was not straightforward. He started out on good terms with the Calvinists, even dedicating his book to Pierre Viry, a respected Reformed leader. However, as tensions grew, especially over issues like church governance, Moulin found himself increasingly at odds with the Calvinists. He developed close ties with the anti-Calvinists, who saw his ideas as a way to challenge the dominance of Geneva. In the end, Jean Moulin's vision of the church was a blend of practicality and localism. He believed that the church should be a community where everyone had a voice, but where the wise and well-educated could guide it. His ideas continue to be relevant today, reminding us that the way we structure our churches can have a big impact on how they function and thrive.